So it's worth noting that Bionicle has been associated with elements since its inception. Each of the characters that were sold to us on store shelves were always associated with one of 6 elements. And obviously, throughout its storyline, there are many more elements to consider as well. Clearly, in 2009, things get kind of switched up, but it's also worth noting that in the story, the elements don't actually play a huge role. Like, yes, there are obvious examples where the elements are important to drive the story along, but there are very few times where characters use elements out of convenience. Most often it's used out of necessity. And I find that quite strange, and it's also reflected in the toys themselves. Very few characters actually have elemental theming going on, aside from their color, with basically the red one being the exception here. So without further ado, let's go ahead and talk about some of these elements. I'll showcase some pieces here that I have in front of me, and if you enjoyed this content, be sure to subscribe. Helps the channel out big time. So without further ado, I want to start with what is likely our introduction, and possibly even your introduction if you're old enough, to Bionicle's first elemental piece. That being the Fire Sword, or I guess the Fire Staff, depending on which character you got first. These two weapons would start a trend that held true for nearly all of Bionicle's run, with basically 2 exceptions, maybe some more. It depends. And that is fire characters always coming with pieces associated with their element. There are obviously some exceptions to this. There are some Matoran that don't have fire weapons at all. Clearly, you have Jollar from 2007, which doesn't have a fire weapon. Kind of makes sense, being in an aquatic theme. I get it. And then you also have Tahu Mystica from 2008, which really doesn't have anything associated with fire either. But it is also worth noting that those are not the only pieces associated with fire itself. Notably, both Borak had fire weapons. It's also worth noting that the Rakshi, Tahu Nuva, and even, if I can get all of these pieces out from in front of me, Vakama in every one of his forms, plus the playset as well. Now, it's worth noting that throughout LEGO's history, not just with Bionicle, but with other themes too, that fire does not always get associated with fire, or at least fire pieces. In many instances, these pieces get recolored to other themes, in some cases green to act as foliage underwater, in some cases blue to act as water itself, or white for ice or clear, etc. And this also holds true for at least one piece from Bionicle's history, notably the Fire Sword getting re-released in 2009 in medium blue, essentially as a water sword. And I love this because fire in and of itself, in its design like this, has a good design language for being able to be used for both fire and water, and even potentially ice to some degree. You could see it as ice crystals. Recolored in black, maybe you could see it as rock crystals, but I think you're starting to stretch at that point. But it's definitely worth noting that these are options. And I also designate sort of 2 different categories, let's say, of environmental weapons. There are purely environmental weapons like we see from the fire swords, and then there are what I would consider environmental weapons. If I didn't just say that, I meant to say elemental. But environmental weapons are what I would consider appropriate for the theme of the character that they come with, the element they're associated with. An example of this would be this shield right here, very clearly inspired by a fin or a fin-like design. It's obvious that this would belong to a water character, at least when I see it. It could definitely be used for other things and has historically in its own past, but I think when I look at a piece like this, the first thing that comes to my mind is water. Now, it doesn't mean that every single piece that came with a character is automatically associated with their weapon, and thus every weapon is environmental, but it's also worth noting that environmental weapons, as they stand, are much more subjective. You could definitely see something like this, for example, this sword from 2007, and see it and say, oh, well, that's environmental because it belongs to a water character. It's got this shark motif, which if you've never seen it, yeah, it's designed to look like a shark. Really cool use of this piece. But on its own, nothing about this piece specifically screams it needs to be aquatic. And so I don't consider it a environmental piece, but you might. And that's where the beauty of having different opinions is most notable. Now, there are plenty of other weapons in front of me here, some smaller examples, or I guess lesser obvious examples, like this one having the lightning go all the way through the blade of the sword itself. But I think what ends up being important is the final year of Bionicle, 2009. And why that's important is because although the characters themselves, to most degrees, do not have elements, The weapons sure as hell do, and not just the weapons. In fact, a lot of the armor that starts appearing in this year, for the first time in many cases, starts to showcase elements as well. Notably, a piece like this, for example, clearly an ice piece with its white and trans blue color scheme. Had it been recolored to, say, black and trans pink or something, you could have easily seen it as underground crystals or amethyst or whatever. Really neat piece. Definitely should have been recolored more than once, but it's lovely in the sense that it's clear that this is an ice piece, or at least an elemental piece. And it was honestly, as far as I'm aware, the first elemental piece associated with ice specifically. Again, I'm talking purely elemental, not necessarily environmental. Again, that's all up to choice though. That said, of course, that's not the only piece associated with ice from that year, because we also get the snowflake shield. Many ice characters had often carried shields in the past. And so to have seen this, to have gotten this finally after so many years, is exceptional as well. Should have also been recolored in the Gelu set, but again, I'm getting ahead of myself here. But of course, again, it's worth noting too that with pieces like this, for example, not a weapon, an armor piece, but still has that rocky texture that helps to continue that sort of elemental pattern. You could start to get into borderlining on environmental here in the sense that the rock maybe is built into it. But again, where the line is drawn between something that is purely elemental and purely environmental, I think is up to you. It's also worth noting that you get the Rock Club from the Strania set, just a wonderful set in general, which, again, a very elemental piece, and I believe the first club that we ever got from Bionicle as well. Now, things start to stretch with our next example, because looking at this piece in one of its colors, silver, it's hard to see it as elemental, but in green, I absolutely consider it elemental and not environmental. And the main reason why is that it is a leaf design, or at least it is to me. If you are familiar with Monstera plants, you've likely seen them. Maybe you don't know the name necessarily, but this essentially is a Monstera leaf turned into a weapon. It's a lovely piece, and it's a fantastic design in and of itself. Again, also one of very few pieces to blend both of these colors, and very fitting for the element, or at least whatever element you want to consider this, jungle in this case. So I think, again, you can start to get into specific elements by just recoloring weapons. Recoloring the fire sword water can make it a water weapon, but it's still elemental, if that makes sense. You've got plenty more to go on here, because you've of course got more fire swords continuing that fire tradition, which basically ran throughout most of Bionicle's run. You've got plenty more environmental pieces, like these blade pieces here, very clearly designed for flight and used in a case where flight is applicable. You've got the ice skate pieces from Kopaka Nuva, which, while I would not consider every Nuva piece purely environmental or elemental, this one is clearly a skate first and foremost, a sword second, and I think it works out in its favor. More wings from 2008 as well. 2007 also runs us the tentacle piece, which again, while I would not consider it elemental, because I don't necessarily think a creature automatically applies an element, it's definitely environmental. It's definitely a piece that belongs underwater. You've got Kina's fin piece here, and you've even got this shield, which, while on first glance may not appear elemental, seeing as how it has this maze on it, that's quite interesting. When you actually look a little bit closer at the negative space between the maze, or on the back here as well, you'll see that it's faceted. It actually has a rocky texture associated with it. And I think it's just a clever use of that negative space. I also think it's mirrored left to right. It's almost mirrored left to right, not quite. Point being, there's a lot from Bionicle's history that is elemental. Even looking into like G2, you've got pieces, and yeah, I'm going to show off a resin cast, but just the one I have on me. But pieces like this, which again, while clearly not on its own elemental, once you start to apply specific colors to it, it can become that way. Had we gotten this in dark gray, it would have looked fantastic, or black for that matter. It would have been a great mask for a rock type character. Anyway, getting ahead of myself. The point stands that elements are an important aspect of Bionicle, but often throughout its history and throughout its story are overlooked or underutilized in many cases. There are probably scenarios where there are certain characters we never even see use their element because there are just so many characters, but also because in some cases we spend very little time with specific characters. And I think it's a little bit unfortunate, but that's part of the beauty of Bionicle, is that it has a little bit of something for everyone. So if you enjoyed this content, let me know your thoughts down in the comments. What elemental piece, or I guess environmental piece, it's up to you, is your favorite from all of Bionicle? I didn't even mention any of the 2009 helmet pieces, many of which incorporate an element for the first time in a mask or helmet-like piece. And also let me know down in the comments or over on the Discord, linked in the description, your thoughts not only on elements, but how they're utilized by the characters. Which portrayal of specific elements do you like the best? Or what aspects of elemental combinations? You can take that conversation further over on the Discord, but you can also check out Instagram and Patreon, both linked down in the description below, and be sure to subscribe. I'll see you all in the next one. Take care.